Welcome to Industry TV Network. Make sure you hit the like button, share, and subscribe. In this video, we'll be touching on the life and times of Etta James. James Etta Hawkins, known professionally as Etta James, was born on January 25, 1938 in Los Angeles, California, to Dorothy Hawkins, who was 14 years old at the time. Dorothy Hawkins resided in the dangerous and impoverished Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, but she had no problem leaving her young daughter alone in the apartment. When Hawkins left her baby alone, she was usually out in the company of men. It was only a matter of time before something had to give. Soon, young James Etta came to the attention of social services, who took her from her mother and placed her with various foster parents. James Etta referred to her mother as the Mystery Lady. Two of James Etta's semi-regular foster parents were Sarge and Mama Lou. Sarge had a drinking problem, but he also liked music. When he noticed James Etta could sing, he liked to show her off to his poker buddies. In the middle of the night, if Sarge felt like listening to music, he would wake up Etta and demand that she sing for him and his buddies. If James Etta didn't comply with his demand, there would be a beating until she did. One of James Etta's escapes from an abusive home life was church. She attended St. Paul's Baptist Church, and people there began to notice that she had a beautiful singing voice. The musical director of the church took James Etta under his wing and decided to train her to become a professional singer. The director's name was James Earl Hines, but he wasn't a savior either. He helped Etta to become a better singer, but his methods were cruel and unusual. Hines wanted Etta to sing from her gut, not her chest, and he had a brutal method to make it happen. Whenever Etta would sing from her chest, he would punch her. Etta's escape from her home life had now turned into a new nightmare. Luckily, Hines was gay, or it might have taken an even darker turn. Yet despite the abuse, Etta had great respect for Hines and what he did to improve her singing. Because of her work with Hines, or in spite of it, James Etta's voice became extraordinary. The Chitlin Circuit was a series of venues around America that gave black entertainers a place to perform for black audiences. This was hugely important due to segregation, which severely limited opportunities for black performers. Through this circuit, Etta got a chance to perform in Nashville, Tennessee at R&B clubs. She grew up performing on the Chitlin Circuit, but Sarge and Mama Lou were still her guardians. This went on until tragedy struck. Etta James was just 12 years old when she started working in clubs and bars. This was only possible while the lenient Mama Lou and Sarge were her guardians, and they allowed it. In 1950, however, Mama Lou passed away. So who would take care of Etta now? Well, out of the woodwork came Etta's biological mother. She lived in San Francisco, and she wanted her daughter with her. Etta's mom, Dorothy Hawkins, had migrated with many African Americans to Fillmore District in San Francisco, California. There was some tension there as white residents were unsure about having such a large influx of African Americans. James Etta didn't take notice of the race relations. Instead, she started skipping school and drinking. There was something else delinquent about James Etta's behavior. She liked doo-wop music. One would think her mother would be happy about this interest in music, but instead, she hated it. James Etta's mother was a fan of music, but not doo-wop music. Hawkins thought jazz was the only way to go, and her favorite singer was Billie Holiday. Hawkins believed that jazz brought out more sophistication than what James Etta was trying to do. James Etta respected performers like Holiday, but her heart was in a different sound. James Etta put a girl group together, and they started performing on street corners. Because the young women in the group were mostly light-skinned like James, they chose the name the Clearettes. James Etta was still barely a teenager, and her dream was already coming true. But this was only the beginning. Her career would move forward because of one person, the multi-talented Johnny Otis. James Etta met Otis in one of two ways. The story is unclear. Either Otis heard the Creolettes playing in LA, or James Etta pursued Otis at his hotel room after a performance and begged for an audition. Knowing James, most would put their money on the latter. Whichever it was, Otis took the Creolettes and decided to turn them into stars. The first thing they had to change, however, was the group's name. Otis arranged to get the Creolettes signed to Modern Records, but there was a catch. He offered the name Peaches to the group as an alternative to the Creolettes. The name stuck, and Modern Records gave them a contract. But that wasn't all he did. Otis also thought that the name James Etta wasn't fit for a star. His solution was simple. Just reverse the two parts of her name and put a space between them. And Etta James was born. At this time, response songs were extremely popular. A response song was when one artist wrote and performed a song in answer to the lyrics of another artist's song. Otis had an idea to answer a Hank ballad song called Work With Me, Annie, and he wanted James to help him with it. Well, Work With Me, Annie already had some very racy lyrics, but James and Otis had a plan to go one step further. Now remember, James was just 16 years old at this time, while Otis was in his 30s. Together their goal was to outdo the innuendo in Work With Me, Annie. The result was Roll With Me, Henry. Forget the lyrics. Even the title was too risque for the time. Many thought it referred to a roll in the hay, which it probably did. To avoid the expected censorship, they renamed the song The Wallflower. This was so it sounded like the planned activity was dancing and not sex. Etta's mother wasn't doing much of a job of raising her daughter, so she moved in with Otis, who was paying her $10 for every performance and keeping the rest. But as far as her writing skills went, Otis was more generous. Her $14,000 for writing The Wallflower went into a trust fund that James could have when she turned 21. She eventually recorded The Wallflower with Peaches, and it became a hit. By February of 1955, the hot rhythm and blues tracks put it at number 1. James had her first taste of stardom, and she was ready for more. What she probably didn't see coming was when superstar Little Richard took notice of her and her group Peaches. When Etta heard that Little Richard was interested, she decided to give herself a makeover. At this point in her career, Etta wanted to change her look. She said she had always been a tomboy, but she knew deep down that wouldn't work in the music world. So she decided to be a glamour girl. She wore high heels, rhinestone earrings, and even a fishtail gown. She may have been a teenager, but she looked like someone much older. James was about to take Etta and her new look on the road, and there was sure to be trouble. Little Richard would go on to get the title of Architect of Rock and Roll, but at this point, he was just a very popular musician. He'd heard Peaches perform, and he wanted them for his national tour. They set out in 1956 and played all over the United States. This was a dream come true for Etta, but something closer to a nightmare happened while she was on tour. Being on tour often meant driving from one gig to another in a car. James was in Texas in a car full of men when they got lost. When the driver pulled over to ask an officer for directions, it became a dangerous situation. The officer looked into the car and saw what he thought was a white girl in a car full of black men. This was Texas in the 50s, so he decided to make a big deal about it. The problem was, Etta's skin was so light, the officer thought that she was white. Not only was the officer not used to seeing this situation, it was actually against the law in Texas. The officer had to repeatedly ask Etta if she was black or white, and not in such nice terms. Finally, James told the officer the truth, and they were free to go. Apparently, a black girl alone in a car full of men was fine. Etta got out of that predicament, but bad things were happening back at home as well. Back in those days, it was common for white artists to borrow songs from black musicians and make them popular to a white audience. Georgia Gibbs was one singer who had built a career on crossover hits. Gibbs took the Wallflower, renamed it Dance With Me Henry, and made it into a huge hit. In fact, it topped the Billboard Hot 100 that year. Clearly, James was full of talent, and it seemed everyone wanted a piece of it. Next, Etta pulled a Beyoncé, or a Diana Ross for that matter, and walked away from her group Peaches and went solo. She soon had her own hit with Good Rockin' Daddy. The next hit, however, didn't come so easily. Soon James was likely regretting her decision to go out on her own. In a desperate move, she decided to leave Modern Records and join Chess Records. The move quickly paid off. While with Chess Records, Etta had a string of hits. She also found a man. While touring with Little Richard, Etta occasionally performed alongside the Moonglows. Now, the Moonglows founder, Harvey Fuqua, was also with Chess Records. James and Fuqua sang a couple of duets, and the chemistry was obvious. Soon, James had her first serious boyfriend. At least, that's what she claimed. Etta toured with Bobby Murray for more than 20 years, and he has something different to say about Etta's first boyfriend. He swears that when Etta was just 16 years old, she dated musician B.B. King, who would have been 29 years old at the time. If this just sounds like idle gossip, consider this. A few years later, King released a single called Sweet 16. Even Etta herself thought that the song was about her. While she was hanging around with B.B. King, Etta met a future king, Elvis Presley. As it turned out, the 19-year-old Presley was a huge fan of B.B. King's. Presley also impressed Etta, and not just for his singing talent. James often commented on his good manners. Eventually, James teamed up and performed with the future king of rock and roll just outside Memphis, Tennessee. Etta seemed to always be at the center of everything happening in music. She still, however, hadn't made an album yet. Etta had 2 hit singles doing duets with Fuqua, and then it was time to once again strike out on her own. What followed was 1960's All I Could Do Was Cry, which hit the number 2 spot on the R&B charts. Leonard Chess of Chess Records saw something in Etta. He thought she could cross over from R&B to pop. His idea to make this happen was to bring in string instruments. The result was My Dearest Darling, which hit the number 5 spot. Now it was time for her debut album. Etta's first album was At Last. The response didn't quite match Chess Records' prediction, but over time, critics have come to see it as hugely significant. In fact, AllMusic gave it 5 stars out of 5, and Rolling Stones eventually put it at number 191 on their top 500 greatest albums of all time. The album also contained what many would later see as James's signature song, At Last. In all, Etta worked for Chess Records for 14 years, and they were manipulating her the whole time. Sadly, the only money she saw from Chess over these years was a meager $10,000. Instead of paying what their artists actually deserved, Chess Records gave them Cadillacs. That's actually where the title of the 2008 film Cadillac Records got its name. Most of the money she earned came from her live performances. Etta continued to record and perform throughout the 1960s. She added a gospel sound to her repertoire, but not everything was godly in her life. Like a lot of musicians at the time, she had developed a drug problem, and it was an expensive one. James's need for her drug of choice cost her more than what she was making. This led her to do some pretty horrible things. At one point in her career, James lost the need to hide her addiction. At one concert, members of the audience could easily see bandages on her arms when she was on stage. This could only mean one thing. The bandages were covering the scars from where she had been shooting up. At one point in her life, James got a chance to meet the woman who her mother thought was the queen of jazz sophistication, Billie Holiday. Holiday, who had her own addiction issues, saw James and knew where her career was heading. She told James flat out, "Don't get involved in drinking and partying and staying out late." Sadly, James didn't listen to Holiday, not even one little bit. Etta's addiction made her do terrible things. Things like taking money from friends, making prescription forgeries, and even selling her body on occasion. Eventually, in 1966, the law caught up with her, and she was put on probation. Her fine for writing a bad check was $500. She later ignored her probation and had to spend a week and a half in prison. Yet during this sad time in her life, she surprisingly sparked a new romance. After making her first dance song in the basement, James headed to Alabama. While there, she recorded Tell Mama and its B-side, I'd Rather Go Blind. She wrote the song with Ellington Jordan, a prisoner she had met, and decided not to have her name as the co-writer. Her idea was that this would save her money for herself and keep it from the tax man. At the time, she was dating a guy named Billy Foster, so she wrote down his name as the co-writer. Foster will go down in history as the writer of this song, even though he didn't do a thing. In 1968, James shared more than a song with Foster. They had a child and named him Danto. Again, in those days, there were a lot more laws about what was right and wrong when it came to dating. One such rule was that a man and a woman could only share a hotel room if they were husband and wife. When officers found out James was in a room with a man, they hauled her into the station. Believe it or not, at this time, this was a chargeable offense, and they threw the book at James. In 1969, James was once again in rehab for her addiction, and she met artist Mills, who was also an addict. The saintly Mills didn't mind becoming a replacement dad to Danto, even though he wasn't the biological father. Like her mother, James didn't see the importance of keeping fathers involved in her children's lives. Mills was obviously deeply in love with James, and later he would pay dearly. The 1970s may have been a brand new decade, but James was having the same old problems. In 1973, offers took her and her husband in for possession, and in 1974, the court sent her to a drug treatment facility. Doctors there treated her with methadone, which she also became addicted to. Compared to her husband, however, she got off lightly. Mills ended up getting a 10-year prison sentence. Being married to James was not working out in his favor. Etta eventually found her way to the Tarzana Psychiatric Hospital, where she spent 17 months in care. At the hospital, she said that almost all of the other patients were white children. One day in the common area, some rock music was playing, and a Rod Stewart song came on. It turned out that the song was a cover of James' I'd Rather Go Blind. When the other patients heard that she had written it, they gained a new respect for their psych ward inmate. Besides this one fond memory, her time at Tarzana remained a low point in her life. Luckily, the only direction she could go in after such a low was up. While still in the psych ward, James received a mysterious letter. It said it was from none other than the Rolling Stones' Keith Richards, who also knew a thing or two about addiction. What would Richards want with her? In the letter, he made her an offer. If you can stay clean, you can tour with the Stones. If that wasn't a reason to fight addiction, I don't know what is. In 1976, Richard followed through on his promise to James. Etta was now a much heavier girl than before, but it didn't stop her from rocking with the Stones. The truth was, neither she, nor Richards for that matter, were free of drug use. Following working with the Rolling Stones, James stopped recording and spent almost 10 years dealing with her addiction issues. Her husband was still in prison serving time, so James began a relationship with Sam Dennis, who was an ex-user who had become a therapist. In 1976, they had a son, Sameto. As Etta got her own life back on track, she was keeping an eye on Janis Joplin's career. In Etta's mind, Joplin was building a huge fan base based on Etta's own singing style. To remedy this, she did something drastic. She went to Joplin's producer in an effort to take back her own style. With Joplin's producer, she made 2 albums, Etta James and Come a Little Closer. While she was dealing with her issues, James still found the time and energy to perform, and sometimes in very unlikely places. For example, she did 2 appearances as a guest at Grateful Dead concerts. In 1984, she performed at the opening ceremony of something rather sporty, the 1984 Summer Olympics. I guess it's safe to assume she got to skip the usually mandatory drug testing. Next up for James was meeting the man she had waited a lifetime to meet. In 1987, James had a random encounter with billiard player Minnesota Fats. Etta's mother had told young Etta that Fats was her biological father. She must have been over the moon to meet him. Of course, she immediately told Fats that she believed he was her father. What Etta said later about his reply is this: he never confirmed it or denied it. I guess that's as close as we'll get to a yes. Things were looking good for James at this time, and it was just about to get even better. By the end of the 1980s, James seemed to have dealt with her issues and was ready to record for the first time in almost a decade. she signed up with Island Records and in 1988 made 7 Year Itch, which referred to her time of not having a contract with the record label. 2 years later, she made yet another album with Island Records, Sticking to My Guns. Clearly, that was a triumphant comeback for Etta. In 1993, even though she did mostly R&B, James got a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. While she said that it was an honor, she had a quibble with the award. She questioned who decided these things. Who decided who was rock and roll and who was jazz? And who decided who was important or not? Even when she was receiving an honor, James was prickly, and that's how her fans liked her. With her next album, she was about to give those fans a shock. In 1993, Etta, with Private Music Records, made Mystery Lady, Songs of Billie Holiday. This was new for James. She had always been an R&B star who also did rock and roll and soul. Now she was heading into jazz. She later said that until this time in her life, she thought of jazz as being very disciplined. In fact, a little too disciplined. She said that when she made Mystery Lady, Songs of Billie Holiday, she was now mature enough to do it. Incidentally, the name of the album was a reference to her mother. She was the Mystery Lady who loved Billie Holiday. Later, James would have another chance to bring her mother back into her life. In 2001, James did an album of jazz standards. Remember, this was the kind of music James's mother had wanted her to sing way back when. To commemorate this occasion, Etta did something hugely sentimental. She asked her mother to sing one of the songs. Hawkins sang the title track, Blue Gardenia. It wasn't a moment too soon either, as Hawkins passed away less than a year later. One of Etta's biggest fans was pop diva Christina Aguilera, who grew up listening to her music. When Aguilera did a cover of Etta's signature song, At Last, Aguilera made sure she told anyone who would listen that the song really belonged to James. She wanted to make sure people knew who Etta was and help her career out in any way she could. Not all the divas, however, were friends with Etta. In 2009, super diva Beyonce had an amazing offer. She could sing at the inaugural ball for America's first black president, Barack Obama. Beyonce decided to sing At Last because she had just played Etta in the film Cadillac Records. When Etta found out about Beyonce's musical choice, she went ballistic, and in true James style, she didn't hold back. She let loose a rant where she said she couldn't stand Beyonce and even threatened to do her bodily harm. Etta's son later said that Etta's words against Beyonce had a predictable cause: drug-induced dementia. I think a more likely reason was that Etta was just being Etta. Sadly, there wasn't much more time for Etta to be Etta. By January 2010, Etta was in poor health. She went into the hospital for an infection, but then her son revealed the really bad news. His mother had dementia. The next year, she got an even worse diagnosis. Etta had leukemia. Believe it or not, Etta was still at this time married to Artis Mills, the man she had married back in 1969. He had been with her through it all. Because Etta was unable to care for herself, Mills got the job as sole conservator. 5 days before her 74th birthday, on January 20th, 2012, Miss Etta James passed away. 8 days later, there was a funeral, and it was a big deal. Stevie Wonder performed, then Christina Aguilera stunned the audience with her stirring rendition of Etta's song, At Last. It looks like Beyoncé, however, kept her distance. Etta James was laid to rest in Inglewood Park Cemetery in LA. Rest in peace to the great Etta James. Ciao for now.